Hey people, I'll be continuing my Prime Minister series pretty soon with Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George. But for this video, I want to talk about another aspect of history, which is very infamous in British history, and that is the Jack the Ripper case, also known as the Whitechapel murders. Although I should differentiate between the two, the Whitechapel murders refers to the whole killing spree between 1888 and 1889. Actually technically up to 1891. Um, Whereas Jack the Ripper refers to five specific victims. Now, I should say this is something that's interested me for a long time. The only reason I haven't made a video about this up to now is simply because I don't know what sort of angle to take it because there's so much to say. But I want to make this video for a few reasons. Number one, to point out a few things that should be obvious but aren't necessarily obvious to people who casually look at this case. And secondly, because it's always topical. I mean, not so long ago, yet another suspect was named. I'll come to him in a minute. But we have a series at the moment called Ripper Street. Actually, it began a few years ago. So this is something that is always, always, always going to be compelling. And I think it's almost part of human nature that we have this interest in the dark side of things. Let's face it. I mean, there's nothing pleasant about Jack the Ripper or the Whitechapel murders, but it's it's compelling because it is such a mystery. Um, and just as soon as someone seems to get a lead and names a suspect and we're convinced that is a suspect, someone else comes along with just as convincing a claim, and then some of the claims, some of the suspectology is absolutely, to me, baseless. So I'd like to just point out a few things. Um, First of all, there's a few myths about the Jack the Ripper case. First of all, one of the myths is that there were no witnesses. I would direct people's attention to the very good online website Casebook Jack the Ripper. Contrary to popular belief, there were actually quite a lot of witnesses, especially in the night of the double event. That is the night that two victims, both attributed to Jack the Ripper, were killed. There were actually numerous witnesses who saw numerous individuals whom they identified as the potential suspect. So the idea that there's no witnesses is not true. In fact, if you look at that website, it's probably the most comprehensive source you will find, more comprehensive even than any book that I know of that's published. It really is a very thorough and comprehensive website, and the good thing about it is it's not biased. So it names the suspects, it provides dissertations, lengthy dissertations, it provides numerous sources, but the website admins themselves don't, or himself, herself, does not themselves can't jump to any conjecture on this. What they do is to provide the material and let people make up their own mind. So I think it's an excellent site if you're interested in this case. So that's the first thing. The idea that there were no witnesses is not true. In numerous cases leading up to the canonical five murders, that is the five women who were said to be definite Jack the Ripper victims. Although I have to say I've got my suspicions about at least two of them, and I'll come to that in a minute. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, and I don't, I wasn't going to do this, but I think it's important. Let's just get one suspect right out of the way. Jack the Ripper was not Prince Albert Victor. The royal conspiracy has been debunked. I know conspiracy theorists love it, but it's been debunked. Why? Because the two central people involved in that conspiracy, Prince Albert Victor and Dr. William Gull, simply could not have been the Ripper, and this is why. Dr. William Gull was in his 70s at the time. This was Queen Victoria's surgeon. Um, and from what I understand, he suffered from arthritis. Now, if you've any knowledge about the Ripper murders, even an older man would have needed a certain degree of strength to pin down these women and even to wield a knife to the point where, in at least one case, he almost decapitated her. That takes a certain degree of strength. and an elderly man with arthritis could not have done that. Would he have had medical knowledge? Well, yes, he was a surgeon, um, but it just isn't plausible. Plus, all the witness statements said the man they saw was aged between 35 and 50. Dr. William Gull was 71 at the time, from what I gather. Prince Albert Victor was 28. However, palace records show that he was in Balmoral at the time, which is the royal estate in Scotland. That's at least 400 miles away from London. Now, even if you don't believe that, he was said to be mentally retarded. Again, he was a very physically weak individual. Um, Now, the sort of royal theory, which began in the 60s, goes something along these lines. Prince Albert Victor had had a relationship with a commoner. I forget her name off the top of my head, but the women who were murdered were basically associates of hers, and they had to be shut up. That is pretty much how the royal theory goes, and sometimes they throw Freemasonry into that. There is a theory that the murder locations point out this pentagram, and it certainly is intriguing. I can understand why people would buy into that because it is very intriguing. And pretty much every modern film adaptation, From Hell with Johnny Depp, um, Jack the Ripper with Michael Caine, I believe that's the title of the film. Pretty much every modern adaptation has thrown the royal theory in. It's baseless. It really, to me, it's one of the weakest theories. It is certainly one of the most interesting, one of the most compelling, but it's also one of the weakest. Um, I'm not saying it's absolutely impossible. I'm just saying that it's highly unlikely. That doesn't mean I believe that Jack the Ripper was an absolutely random street thug, which some people have projected. I do think this was an exceptional killer, and I do think that this was not your run-of-the-mill East End thug. I do believe it was probably a local man, or at least someone who was not a prominent individual. It could have been a sailor. There is one suspect. Actually, I'll name a few suspects. I'm not going to get into really deep details in this video, but a few of the suspects I have been interested in personally is Francis Tumblety, Robert Dunstan Stevenson, and Carl Fagenbaum. Those three individuals strike me as particularly interesting, and I'll just say a brief few things about them. Francis Tumblety had a psychotic hatred of women. He collected wounds. His physical appearance fitted a lot of the witness descriptions, and he was a schizophrenic. Now, all of these things tie into some of the accounts that the witnesses gave. Robert Dunstan Stevenson, again, he had some medical knowledge. He was in London at the time. In fact, he was in a London hospital. He showed a profound interest in the case. Now, that in itself I would dismiss because so did a lot of people. I mean, so did the whole city of London and pretty much everyone who is anyone at the time. You know, if you were around in 1888 and you had any notion of newsworthy events, then you're going to be interested. But Dunstan Stevenson is certainly an interesting case, and he's worth reading up on. And finally, this guy Carl Fagenbaum. There is a documentary online, Jack the Ripper, a new suspect. I believe that's the name. And basically, the researcher goes to the United States and finds out that there was a German sailor who was convicted of killing a woman. So this was a man prone to violence. He was a murderer, and the woman he killed was killed in a Ripper-like fashion. The location was Lower East Side, which was basically New York City's equivalent of London's East End. It was a tough inner city area. So he done research and he worked out that what he needed to find was there any connection with this German sailor and London's East End in the autumn of 1888. Frustratingly, he couldn't find the records as to whether or not the ship was in dock, but he'd done more research, and finally the connection was there. And I think he finalised that there was records that Carl Fagenbaum was in London in 1888. Now, this individual was prone to violence. His age was about right. He was in his late 30s, I believe. His build, his description, everything. And he was said to have had a hatred of women. Now, certainly, he would not have been the only man in London at the time prone to violence or mental health problems, or with a hatred of women. But there's a lot of things that tie into this. I'll say a quick word about the Walter Sickert thing because um, Patricia Cornwall has made a particularly controversial claim that the artist Walter Sickert was the Ripper. I don't think her claim is baseless. I do think she has something in that, and certainly I would concede that some of his paintings are downright, well, they raise eyebrows, let's put it that way. But for an artist to simply, someone put it this way, Walter Sickert's only crime was to record life as it was. Walter Sickert was a realist, and he painted life as it was. He painted an infamous picture called The Camden Town Murder, which was the murder of a prostitute in Camden Town in 1907, 20 years after the Ripper case. Now, some people have conjectured that that indicates that he had this fascination with murdering women. Now, in that picture, it shows a semi-nude woman and a man sitting by her bedside with rubbing his hands. Now, some people say that alludes to the Mary Kelly murder, which was the last of the canonical five. Well, that really is open to debate. She actually purchased one of his paintings so that she could prove that there was DNA samples in it that fitted Walter Sickert, and she wanted to connect this, I believe, to the shawl of Catherine Eddowes. I'm going to watch the documentary after this because I watched it a few years ago. Can't remember the details, but I think where she goes wrong is that she is has been somewhat arrogant in her claim in the sense that she says case closed. Well, it's not case closed. You can't make a claim like that because even if it's a strong claim, there's equally strong claims out there. So I think a lot of people have kind of pointed out that it's a little bit arrogant of her to say that it is case closed. Um, Having said that, I think that Sickert is at least a mediocre suspect. I don't believe he's one of the leading suspects, but nor do I believe he's completely insignificant as a suspect. There's others that I would. I mean, some people have named Lewis Carroll the writer. I think that's pretty lightweight because they claim that there's an ambergram in one of his books. Well, the thing about Lewis Carroll, it's long been suspected that by today's standards he was a paedophile. Even if that's true, well, what would that indicate? It would indicate that his interest was in young girls, not middle-aged women, which is what most of the victims were. Um, I personally do believe that there is a very strong plausibility that Jack the Ripper wasn't stationary. He didn't stay in London. So there were murders of Carrie Brown in New York in 1891, um, and there has been a claim for a killer in South Africa. But the problem against that is that the suspect was very young at the time. I mean, everyone who's anyone has been named. Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father, was named. The Marquess of Salisbury, Prime Minister at the time, was named. Even one of the most bizarre claims is it was Queen Victoria herself. That has to be the most insane. Believe me, if Queen Victoria had wandered out of the palace late at night, someone would have noticed. William Gladstone, people have claimed because of his thing for saving foreign women. But the thing is, Victorian London was the most populous city in the world. At that time, it had a population of about 5 million people, which by 19th century standards was a mega city. There was all sorts of people living there. So pretty much any eccentric character, you could say, oh, well, he is eccentric for this reason, he might be Jack the Ripper. And I think there's one problem with suspectology. Well, there are many problems. But one of the main problems, I think, is it kind of slanders these people for eternity. Now, I don't have so much sympathy with those who were convicted of serious crimes because they were convicted of serious crimes anyway. But for innocent men who have kind of been tied to Jack the Ripper and they may well be completely innocent, it's kind of like they're being slandered from beyond the grave, and it's quite unfortunate. The truth is, even if one of these people that has been named was the killer, it doesn't really matter because there's going to be someone else who will contradict it in some way. So I believe he there's either it's one of two things. Either he's already been named, and there's going to be eternal debate about that, or he hasn't been named and he was an anonymous character. I think I have another theory on this. Thousands and thousands of letters were sent to the press at the time. Only about four of those letters have been seen as authentic. Now, this is something that I don't think anyone else has really raised. What if some of those letters that were sent that were dismissed as hoaxes actually had a bit more weight to them? Now, the letters that were sort of seen as more likely, more authentic, like the Dear Boss letter, the From Hell letter, what if there were other letters sent to the Central Press Agency um, that were actually written by the killer and they were dismissed as hoaxes? You have to understand the authorities were working under immense pressure, and the labour laws in those days weren't the same as today, so I'm sure these guys were working on under immense pressure. They were only human, so there may well have been times they weren't entirely thinking clearly because they were exhausted. So it may well be that key evidence was ignored, and we'll never know. Therefore, it is quite likely. I mean, it's true that the lowest type of journalist probably tried to stir things up. In fact, it was a journalist that coined the term Jack the Ripper. But that's a theory I have, that some of those letters may have had more weight to them because there was thousands sent. The idea that they were all fakes, I find a little bit dismissive. Um, as for the Jill the Ripper theory, well, again, I wouldn't entirely dismiss that. I think it's unlikely. Personally, I sway more to it being a man, simply because, well, number one, most killers are men, but simply because most of the witnesses described a man. However, Arthur Conan Doyle and others have put a female suspect out there. There's a few plausible reasons why. Number one, a woman would be able to escape unnoticed because, for example, if she was a midwife, she could have wandered around with a blood-stained apron and dismissed it as, her job, delivering babies. Um, and a butcher, incidentally, would have had the same alibi. Bear in mind, this was before the days of DNA. I mean, literally just before DNA was invented the year afterwards, I believe. No, no, what am I talking about? I'm talking about fingerprint that was invented the year after. DNA, of course, was only discovered in the 20th century. But another plausibility would be a woman who was bitter with perhaps a husband who contracted syphilis, and she took out her rage on these fallen women, as she saw it. So I wouldn't entirely dismiss that idea. But like I say, a lot of the things I'm saying you can find on Casebook Jack the Ripper. I may well make other videos as I think about certain things, angles that may be worth looking at. Yeah, about the victims, I've spoken a bit there about the suspects. About the victims, generally speaking, the five victims are considered to be Polly Nichols, or Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. I think that of those five, the least likely is probably Liz Stride. But people say that the reason she wasn't mutilated the way the others were is because the killer was disturbed. But the only thing really connecting her is that the knife went from, I believe it was left to right, but there was no mutilation on her body, and the area was completely a very strange location. It was outside a working men's pub, for goodness sake. Now that would have meant that Jack was taking a hell of a risk. I mean, it could well be that he was arrogant enough at that point to do that, but it was still a hell of a risk for any killer. People say that he was disturbed. I think that Martha Tabram, who was a very early victim and who has sometimes been seen as not a plausible victim because she was seen that night with horse guards, that is, soldiers, and they've been dismissed as her possible killer. But I believe that the way she was killed does fit into the way that the other victims were killed. So I believe that Martha Tabram is quite a plausible victim. Now, the general reason why they say those were the canonical five was after Mary Kelly was killed. Her killing was so brutal that the theory is that Jack had done what he wanted to do, and he was either caught or executed or died. Montague Druitt, for example, died immediately afterwards. He's one of the suspects. Um, that's there's some weight to that, but there were some victims killed afterward. For example, there was a woman, Frances Coles, a prostitute. She died in 1891, and the way she died, she wasn't mutilated, but the way her throat was cut certainly would be Ripper-esque. And a policeman actually caught someone there, but the guy escaped. Um, with Mary Kelly, it's known that she had a violent boyfriend. Now, what needs to be remembered is the East End at this time was a very violent place, so domestic violence was extremely common. Homicides were common. So a violent boyfriend or a violent partner killing his girlfriend, his wife, was not unheard of. But I think the thing about Mary Kelly was, if you see the photographs of her death, it would have taken an utter psychopath, an utterly sadistic or deeply disturbed individual to do to her what was done. There's a very compelling theory that it wasn't Mary Kelly at all, that Mary Kelly survived, um, and that she was in debt. She came in, she saw the woman whom she was subletting this place to, and then she took this opportunity to escape from the world. And they do allude to that in the film From Hell. Um, so yeah, there's so many questions. I'm going to round up pretty soon, but just a quick word about some of the films. Like I say, the royal theory is very intriguing, but it's more or less been debunked. However, leaving aside the flaw from that, From Hell as a film, I would say is a pretty good film. I think it certainly gets the sinister aspect in there. Um, Pretty good acting all round. One of the worst adaptations I've seen is a film called The Ripper, which is 1997. No fault of I think it's Samuel West plays Jack the Ripper, which is ironic. He plays Prince Albert Victor, and in real life he's a pretty left-wing socialist. That's beside the point. That film is riddled with flaws. I mean, they talk about the Liberal Prime Minister, William Salisbury, who was a Conservative Prime Minister, but there's so many little details they get wrong. The chronology of the victims is completely messed up. Just everything, pretty much. It's really probably the weakest film I've seen, and it ends up just absurd, where um, Detective Aberline gets into a fight with Prince Albert Victor in Buckingham Palace. It's watchable. But it's so far out there. And the Michael Caine version isn't too bad, and there's memorable scenes in that, such as what really did happen when they discovered Mary Kelly's body. The sort of tax collector was banging on her door, and he saw a mutilated body, and he was absolutely shocked. Um, there's an old film I've just watched, The Lodger, and this was before the Royal Theories came about. That's actually quite a good adaptation. Again, it's far-fetched in certain scenes, but it lends into the idea that a wealthy family was actually lodging Jack the Ripper, and some good twists in that. I won't spoil the film, but it stars Meryl Oberon and George Sanders. There's other films with the same title. One was an early Alfred Hitchcock film from the 30s, another one from the 20s. There's many, many films on this. This is going to be a perpetual subject. You know, it's like Sherlock Holmes. It's going to be out there forever. Um, and no doubt more suspects will be named. So I'll leave it there. Um, if you've any questions, I have studied this case quite a lot. Feel free to ask. Not saying I'm an expert, but maybe there's some basic things you might like to know. But I would refer to that site, Casebook Jack the Ripper. It's very, very informative. Final point, I've been to a few of the murder sites in London. One is Mitre Square in the city of London, where Catherine Eddowes was found. Another one is, today it's called Henrique Street. Then it was Berners Street, where Liz Stride was found. So that was the double event. The other three I haven't seen yet. I'm going to go to London though, and I'm going to check some of those out. They're still a little bit sinister because some of the Victorian buildings are still there. Um, so I'll leave it up there. Um, Let me know if you have any theories and what's your rationale for those theories. Yeah, I'm sure I'll make other videos about this.